Hello everyone, it's lovely to see so many of you here joining us. This is our What is a Mini Pupillage / Pupillage and How Do I Get One evening. My name is Tanisha, I'm the Vice President and Treasurer of the QMCAS Society. We're really happy to be able to host this panel in collaboration with the Commercial Awareness Society. And from them we have our the President Eva. Just a matter of housekeeping, can I please ask that all of your microphones are muted during the talk? But also, if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to pop them in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them at the end if we have time. Just to introduce the panelists for the evening, we have Cheryl Jones, who is the head of 3 Paper Buildings. Daisy Noble.
Head of Pupillage at 3 Paper Buildings, not head of 3 Paper Buildings.
Sorry, apologies for that, head of Pupillage. Daisy Noble, who is a barrister at Francis Taylor Building, and also Mera Golden, who's also a barrister at Francis Taylor Building. Mara, the competitions officer for the QMCAS Society, will be asking the questions to our panelists. So if we are ready, we will go over to her.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanisha. Now, in the order of introduction that Tanisha just made earlier, would the panelists give a short introduction about themselves, and then we can continue with the questions.
All right. Well, I think I go first. I'm Cheryl Jones. I'm head of Pupillage at 3PB. I'm a barrister. I was called in 1996, and I also sit as a recorder and a deputy ICC judge in the Rolls Building, but my obsession slightly is with pupillage and helping people get through what is a very, very difficult and tricky process. So I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm Daisy Noble. I'm a barrister, junior barrister at Francis Taylor Building. I was called in 2015, so it hasn't been too many years since I went through this process. So it's really nice to be here and hopefully offer some sort of insight into the mini pupillage and pupillage process. You're on mute, Mero.
I just saw that, sorry, classic Zoom. Hello everyone, yes, I'm Mera Golden. I'm also a barrister at Francis Taylor Building, called in 2014, so just 1 year ahead of Daisy, so also a junior barrister. And so likewise, it wasn't too distant a memory of going through the recruitment process. And I even remember before deciding on a route to the bar, looking at law firms as well. So I remember it all very vividly. So hopefully can help with the questions.
Okay, thank you. Just a note before we go on to the questions, if anyone has any specific questions that they would like to ask, please leave them in the chat box, and then we will try to address them all at the end of the questions. Now, some general questions. I guess the first one would be, what is a mini pupillage and what is a pupillage, and whether they are both incredibly competitive?
Mera, you take this one. You look enthusiastic.
Right. Okay. Well, mini pupillage is essentially a sort of a work shadowing opportunity to experience life in chambers and see what life is like as a barrister. And usually they are between 1 day and a week long. You apply to a chambers usually to do them, so you need to look at websites of chambers to find out information on how they run their mini pupillage schemes. They very much vary, mini pupillages, between being, some of them are very informal and some are much more formalised and assessed. You might have to do written work and advocacy exercises that are assessed as part of their recruitment process towards pupillage. So many pupillages are more the work experience, and pupillage is actually the formalised training that you need to become a barrister. So the mini pupillages do vary quite a bit, but they're really designed for you to get work experience and see what different practice areas are like at the bar. Whereas, as I say, pupillage is more your formal training year to become a barrister. And actually, I've heard it say, people say, what makes a barrister become a barrister, or something along those lines, and someone says it is pupillage. The pupillage year it's tough, and you learn a lot, and it's quite an intense year, but it is really what you go into it as a student, really, and you come out at the other end as a qualified barrister. So it's a year-long scheme as well, and you've got 2 parts to it. You've got your first 6 months period, which we call the first 6, and your second 6 months period, which we call the second 6. And most places are the same. Your first 6 months is more about shadowing, and your second 6 months is more about you're more on your feet and you're doing your own cases in the second 6 months. It can vary slightly, but that's generally the gist. And as I say, it's a steep learning curve, but that's where you get your on-the-job training to become a barrister.
Can I just add to that, as somebody who's run pupillage for a while now, that Mary's absolutely right, that it's during that year of pupillage that you actually become a barrister. And that's important for you to know, because we're not expecting you to be the finished product when you apply to us. We're not expecting you to know it all or do it all. We're looking for potential, because we can teach you a great deal, and we do teach you a great deal. And I can see Daisy and Mero both nodding there, because it's an incredibly intense year. It's completely different from a mini pupillage. It's a very, very intense year, and you will learn a lot. And one of the things that is really noticeable is that from the day you start to the day you finish, there is a point at which I see, and members of chambers just see, something tick over, and suddenly you're a barrister. And it's really, really hard to define exactly when that happens. But what you need to know, what you need to do, is concentrate on getting the you need to get the basics, but you don't need to be a barrister until you do your pupillage. And in fact, it's impossible to become a barrister, I think, without a pupillage. It's the whole experience of doing it. Whereas I would say a mini pupillage, if you're very fortunate and you get in a chambers which takes them relatively seriously, you'll get just a taste of what it's like being a pupil. But what you won't really get is a full taste of what it's like being a barrister. But you'll have the chance to observe people who are barristers, and notice how very different they all are, which is another thing I think you all need to bear in mind, which is barristers come from all sorts of different places. They're all sorts of different people. They've always had all sorts of different characters and personalities. You don't have to fit a mould. You just need to find the right fit for yourself.
So just to add to that, because I've seen a question pop up, so I think I might as well scoop that up now while we're talking about this. So mini pupillage, by its nature being sort of a work experience period for a short period of time, is generally unpaid. I know some chambers give some sort of assistance financially, and some chambers allow you to apply for some assistance financially if, for example, you had to take a week off your job, or if you had to travel to London and that was going to be difficult for you. But generally, mini pupillage is unpaid. And by contrast to that, obviously, pupillage is a job. Whilst you are a pupil, and some of the work you're doing is effectively shadowing, especially at the beginning, it is a full-time job, and you will get what's called a pupillage award, and that differs hugely between chambers. I think it's fair to say there is a minimum level at which it is set, and all the information on specific chambers is available on the website, and that sometimes allows you, in fact, to draw down money the year before if you're doing the BPTC, which is the professional training course that you have to do at university the year before. So that is just to deal with that question there. Yes, you are paid, and as Mero said, because there's this sort of the first 6 months and a second 6 months, there's often what's called guaranteed earnings for your second 6 months, which means that you can earn your own money during that time, doing your own work, almost like being a driver with a learner plate on. But you generally are guaranteed a certain level of income. So yeah, it's not unpaid. Pupillage isn't unpaid.
Okay, thank you. And for those still wondering whether to go to the bar or whether to become a solicitor, could you describe the differences between a mini pupillage in a vacation scheme and a pupillage in a training contract?
Should I take pupillage and training contract on this first? Because the whole ethos is completely different. A training contract, you are employed. You get your own, you very often get your own files to run. Although it's training, it's much more on-the-job training, a little bit like an apprenticeship where you actually start doing things and earning money for the firm, so they charge you out. A pupillage, on the other hand, you are paid by Chambers, but Chambers, in fact, makes no money from you at all during your year, because they give you money, and the work that you do in your second six, the money that you earn there is yours to keep in most Chambers, that you don't pay anything back. So that is a fundamental difference. A training contract is effectively employment. A pupillage is not employment. It's a little bit, it's unique, I think, in many ways. It's like an apprenticeship, but again, you're not employed and you don't have apprenticeship indenture type things. But it's very much looser, and Chambers, Chambers' financial setup is completely different from a solicitor's firm. A solicitor's firm is profit making. It pays salaries to the people in it, whereas all barristers, in fact, pay themselves to Chambers. Barristers are self-employed, so they pay a percentage into Chambers, and the pupillage's award is paid out of that percentage. So Chambers doesn't make money from you. Solicitors do make money from you as a training under a training contract, but the whole ethos is very different. It's very difficult to explain, but it really depends a lot. If you want to be a barrister, then you have to have certain characteristics which perhaps don't make you so comfortable being a solicitor.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I just add to it sort of on one big difference between pupillage and training contracts is pupillage is only 1 year and training, sorry, my flight plane's coming in. And training contract is 2 years. So that's quite a big change and or difference between the two. There's everything we say is caveated by obviously it will vary amongst different law firms, the size of the law firm and what they're like, and similarly with Chambers as well. But generally, I think there's likely to be more review with a training contract. There's often a bit more of a larger intake, particularly with the big firms. There might be 80, 100 of you in 1 year, whereas the maximum you're going to get in the Chambers is maybe, I think, 5 or 6 at some of the larger sets that have more pupils. But most Chambers, it's 1 or 2. Certainly at Francis Taylor Building, we take 2 a year. So I think that's a big difference as well. And I think I'll just echo everything that Cheryl was saying. I mean, the professions are quite different in their day-to-days. Things like as a barrister, you are self-employed. And you really feel that in pupillage because in your second six you'll be, as we said, doing your own cases, but also you are starting to run your own business, and you might start hiring an accountant, etc., to help you with that in your second six. So you'll feel the difference of the professions, I think, in the training experiences as well. I mean, maybe if I touch on also on the mini pupillages versus vacation schemes, I think, again, subject to all the caveats that it will vary between different places, but vacation schemes are generally, I think, quite formalised. You might have 1 or 2 weeks and a few sessions of those for a law firm a year, whereas minis are a bit more, I think, rolling often with Chambers. So you'll have people coming in every week, maybe 1 or 2 minis. It will vary between sets, but there may be some of the mini pupillages are, I think, a lot more informal than vacation schemes. As we've said, some other Chambers do have these more assessed mini pupillages, and they're more formalised. I think also, again, it may be that vacation schemes is more of a group coming in for a couple of weeks, whereas at minis you might be doing it on your own, or only with one other person. So yeah, again, it's sort of indications a bit about the job as well.
I would just add though that I think it's important at your stage, especially if you don't know necessarily which avenue you want to go down, that you don't have to just do a vacation scheme or a mini pupillage. In fact, I did vacation schemes and mini pupillages, and I compared the two. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that ultimately you want to see which environment you want to work in, what sort of work suits you. And don't be afraid, you know, you don't have to go to a vacation scheme pretending that that's definitely what you want to do, or go to a mini pupillage and pretend that's definitely what you want to do. It is a process of sort of discovery for you as well. So I think I would encourage you to, you know, experience it for yourself and apply to both.
A couple of questions coming up about differences between solicitors, barristers, solicitor advocates. I don't think we can really get into those today. It's taking us a little bit off topic. So I'm going to go on to, there's another question here. The only way to get pupillage or a mini pupillage is after clearing barrister training course. The answer is you've got to differentiate in your minds between mini pupillages and pupillage. They are completely different, totally different. A pupillage is the formal training, and you can only start that after you've finished the bar training course, whatever it's being called at the moment. The BPTC, I think, is going to die a death shortly, but so you have to do that before you can start a pupillage, but you can apply before you do the BPTC. With a mini pupillage, you can apply any time for a mini pupillage to most chambers. In our chambers, we do prefer, we don't look at anybody under the age of 18, and we do prefer somebody to be in their second year of their degree. But other than that, there's very few chambers put any restrictions on who comes. In fact, the earlier one can do a mini pupillage or two, or as Daisy said, if you can do some work experiences at a solicitor's firm as well, the better, because it helps you clear your mind and see which one you prefer, or even throw your hands up and go, I think I'm going to go and do history instead, because law is not for everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, moving on to more application-focused questions. The first question is whether someone needs any prior legal experience before applying for a mini pupillage.
No, not for a mini pupillage. The whole point of the mini pupillage is to get the legal experience. So I don't think that any chambers that I know of says you have to have legal experience before applying for a mini pupillage. So, because that's the purpose of it.
I would just add to that, I absolutely agree with everything Cheryl said in terms of trying to get the experience early is really the best thing you can do. The only caveat, I think, and Cheryl said that for her chambers, they prefer people who have, you know, either in their second year of a law degree or started the GDL, I think. And actually our chambers, just really so that the mini pupil gets the most out of the experience, we don't look at applications for anyone who isn't either in their second year at least of their law degree or who has started the GDL. And I think chambers will differ on that, so it is just worth bearing in mind that it's worth checking individual chambers so you don't waste the time making an application. And that really is just so that you have you really get the most out of the experience and you understand what is going on.
Yeah, and I just echo what's been said about the sort of purpose of a mini pupillage is to get that experience of and to try things out, really, to try I definitely remember trying different areas of law out. So spending some time with the criminal set, spending some time with the commercial set, and almost in a way it can be useful to tick things off your list as well, to say this is very interesting but it's not for me. So don't be afraid, I think, of experimenting and applying to a number of different kinds of places to get a feel. Because one thing I would say at the bar is your day-to-day life as a barrister in different practice areas really varies. I mean, it could not be in some ways more different. I think people think there's a maybe a misconception that barristers have the same kind of style, but your experience as a criminal barrister is going to be very different to, you know, trust and estates barrister, and you know, all kinds in between. So I just emphasize that, and the way you find out what day-to-day life is like is doing the minis.
The other part of the question, I think, is what do you put on your application when you're applying for mini pupillage? You just put down why you want to have a mini pupillage. We're quite used to looking at that. We want somebody who looks a little bit enthusiastic. And the other tip I would say with any application is make sure it's really well structured and well put together, because if you make a sloppy application, it's going to go to the bottom of the pile. Look as if you, even, it doesn't matter what stage you're at, put something together that looks good, that looks enthusiastic. Mention an interesting fact about yourself that means that you're interested in the law. Some chambers do look at what degree you've got, but most of us don't. I agree that you need some background in law in order to get anything really out of a mini pupillage, but not all sets require that. And just don't try to be too clever in any application. Trying to be too clever will end up cutting yourself. Just put down the truth and explain why you want this, and make it clear that you really, really do want it. And there was a question from somebody else about, there's usually a question on any mini pupillage, or in fact, for that matter, any pupillage application, of why this particular chambers. And we know perfectly well, to be frank, those of us who mark them as I do, we know perfectly well that the correct answer to that is, I'm applying to you because you're offering mini pupillages and pupillages, and that's what I want. So it's a little bit of an unfair question in some ways, but if you can just say, you can find stuff on the internet. I mean, you're all in many ways better off than I was 25 years ago when I was looking for mini pupillages, when you had to sort of trail around and try and find and talk to people, because you can go online and you can type something in about a particular set, and it will say, you know, that one of the members has just done a case in the Supreme Court, you know, in planning with their great junior Mero and Daisy, you can mention that in your application. I noticed that there was this amazing decision in the Supreme Court, and you had some junior members acting as juniors in there, and that would be really interesting. That's why I'm applying to you. Something like that. Or it always goes to flattery, gets you everywhere.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I would say don't be afraid of looking at Chambers' website, because I mean, Chambers don't expect you to have intimate knowledge of, you know, everything that goes on in Chambers when you haven't even been for a mini pupillage. But I think absolutely look at the website, find things that you actually find interesting, look through maybe not even just the first page of cases, but, you know, look a bit further back. I think it's really good to look at what the juniors are doing, because it's all very well to say, you know, this top ranking QC has just done this case, but actually, as Cheryl says, if there's a junior involved, or if some of the junior members are doing cases, that gives a sort of, it shows that you understand what life as a junior would be like at the Chambers. And I think that I tend to find, looking at applications, that sort of gives slightly more realistic impression that you understand what life might be like at the Chambers. And I think another thing is just to bear in mind that, you know, if you do come across, you know, members of the Chambers, maybe at talks, at events like this, at pupillage fairs, make a note of their names, because actually to be able to say, oh, I came to this talk and Mero and Daisy were talking about, you know, pupillage, and that's how I sort of came across FTB, and then I looked up the Chambers, etc. It just adds something that shows that, you know, you've sort of really engaged with the set as far as you're able to. So I think just little things like that are actually quite good ways to answer that question.
Thank you. That perfectly leads into our next question. So apart from what you already mentioned, what are other aspects that Chambers look for in applications? And is there anything that you saw in an application that particularly stood out to you?
Shall I go? I think it's a hard question because, as I keep saying, they do differ across different chambers. I think one thing that I was told, which really stuck with me, and I think is a good piece of advice, is when it comes to the written application, especially for pupillage, but also the case throughout any application in law. See it as your first demonstration of your ability to advocate in writing. So see it as a way of persuading them why they should call you in for an interview. And it sounds very lame, but it kind of makes it a bit more fun. It goes the same for what we've just been saying about research your chambers. I mean, you can see that as part of you supporting your case. You've done your research and why you think you fit with the chambers. But I certainly remember when I first was doing applications, I was writing, I mean, I think now they often have word limits on them, but I was writing quite verbose, long answers about everything. And I had a friend of mine who got pupillage earlier than I had, and he looked through and gave some very helpful hints about keep it short, keep it to the point, keep it easy to read. You can have bullet points in your applications where appropriate. Basically keep it punchy. You've got to remember that your applications are going to be read by, barristers like Daisy and I, and we'll be sitting there, and we might have a lot of work on at the moment, and we've got to get through a lot of applications, and we do get a lot of applications. So I know this is more about how to get your application to stand out actually in the way it's written, rather than actually the content of what you're writing. I think in terms more of the content of what you're writing, obviously grades are important at the bar. I think you can't say they're not. So you do focus on your academic studies, that is important. But we're also looking for demonstration of advocacy skills, both in writing and oral advocacy. That could be in terms of mooting, if you've done mooting competitions or any kind of public speaking. It doesn't necessarily have to be in law, but just demonstrating that you like standing on your feet and saying something, that helps. And I think if you can, any kind of work shadowing experience of law also helps on your application forms. But really, I think when it comes to written applications, one thing I'd also say is sometimes it's not so much about what you've done, but the way you present it and the way you sell it. So, I remember writing one of my application forms. I know that, something for a barrister is being able to time manage a lot of different cases, and that's a skill you need to have, juggle lots of different time commitments. And this year, I've been really busy, and I've been working, this job or this volunteering thing, plus my studies, plus I've been trying to do the sports team. I'm making this up, but there was that year I was busy, and I was sort of saying it's the skill that I took away from that, that I remember highlighting in the application form. So think laterally about what you've done and try and think of clever ways to show that it demonstrates the skills of being a barrister.
I'd definitely echo everything Mary said. I think the more you write, the more likely it is you'll say something that won't go down well, or will be wrong, or you'll have a typo in because you're trying to get it done before a deadline and you've got lots of applications to do. So I think absolutely keep it short and punchy and to the point. And I guess balanced against that is the fact that very well all the things you've done, the positions you've held, what you've worked on. But remember that the person reading it doesn't necessarily know. So if you say, I was involved in this project, and you give a project title, that's all very well. But if you want me to understand the role you had and what that is, a line to explain what that is really helpful, because actually I've seen quite a few applications where people have said things that sound very impressive, but I have no idea what they are. They're not put in context for me. So I think it's saying enough to create a picture and make the person understand what that actually entailed, whilst at the same time, keeping it short and to the point, because no one wants to read an essay for every single question, I think.
Yes, we just make it easy for us to read. Make it attractive for us to read. Not just in the way you write, but in the way you lay it out, because a long screed of prose may contain some wonderful things in, but your eyes get very tired trying to read it, particularly if we have 300 applications. So people who are reading those, we get tired. So we want something that's easy, feed it to us easily. And the other thing is that we can't dig through everything and work out what it is you're trying to say. So do try and say it clearly. And I said it earlier, but I'm going to say it again. Your grammar and your spelling are incredibly important. You are making an application for a job which and this is particularly important for pupillage, but it does apply to mini pupillage as well, because you're looking to do a job which requires you to use language. So demonstrate it to us from the start. And you can use almost anything in your life as well to illustrate something. I mean, for example, I had an application where somebody had gone grape picking, not something you would have thought was particularly relevant. And then they explained to me in 2 lines that of course it was relevant, because they had shown that they had persistence, they had shown that they didn't give up, they had shown that they were able to do routine things as well as all the other wonderful things they were telling me about elsewhere. And I sat there thinking, you know, grape picking is probably a very good qualification to become a barrister, because they did it in such a good way. Other things and tips that I do give people specifically is where, for example, you have a question about dealing with people or volunteering or helping people, which is something that everybody does do. It doesn't necessarily have to be with law. If you have done voluntary with your local community, with your local religious organisation, if you have helped out at school with advocating for fellow pupils, all of this is really useful and shows that you're somebody who cares and who wants to help. And all of it counts. So don't think that just because you haven't got much experience in law, you haven't got experience. And don't think that just because you are 19 or 20 and at university, you haven't got things that you can really, really use. The pandemic, in fact, will give a lot of you some really good help, I think, because you can put on there about how well you coped with this awful, awful thing that happened, and you know, how this demonstrates your resilience and your ability to pick yourself up and get on with things, which is a characteristic that we all look for at the bar. So everything can be used, everything. You just need to use your abilities, which we hope you have already, to look at something and to put it in a slightly different context so that it makes sense and so it's relevant.
Thank you. That was definitely very eye-opening. Now on to our next question. Do postgraduate qualifications boost applications and help applicants stand out? For instance, a master's in commercial law or international arbitration or anything like that?
Let me go first this time, and then I'll be quiet for a while. The short answer is yes, but it's not determinative, because to be quite frank, the level of applications we get, all of us, is very high. You don't necessarily have to have a master's. It's not essential. You could have a very, very good degree and some work experience, which might attract the attention. So the answer to that is yes, it does, but I'm not so sure it helps you stand out. It boosts your application, but the plain fact of the matter is there are a lot of LLMs around. There are a lot of people these days who are doing, for example, mediation skills courses, which all add a little bit. The idea always is to look for something in your own life or that you've done which makes you stand out, which is slightly different. But the short answer is yes, it helps, but it's not essential.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I think, you know, if you've got a good first degree, it's by no means essential to do a master's. And actually, I don't think you should be doing a master's just to put it on your pupillage application, if that makes sense. If it is something you are interested in, a subject you want to study further, then by all means do that, almost for its own sake. And I do actually think, because I did do a master's, and I think actually the way that it helped me was that I came across in more depth a lot of things that I was interested in that when I went to the interview, I could talk about in more detail, and it probably made me a slightly more interesting interviewee. But I really think to anyone that's considering just doing it because they think they should for their application, I don't think that is a good enough reason to do it. Do it if you really want to do it in something you're passionate in, and, you know, good on you for doing that. But I think that ultimately is what I'd say on that.
Yeah, and I would echo everything that's been said. I think, you know, for example, from Francis Taylor Building, we I don't know if we've mentioned, but we specialise mainly in planning law, do a lot of environmental work as well, and a number of different other areas. But for planning, it's not necessarily something that you study at law school. Certainly it's not one of the core subjects, and we're not expecting necessarily that people know about it before they come to us. So in terms of masters, it's not so much that we're looking for someone who's gone off and studied a master's in planning law necessarily, but if you look at our most recent tenants, a lot of people have gone, if they have studied, it will be in different areas, completely different maybe to planning. And I guess echoing what Daisy said, if you've got a passion for a subject, you know, that's a great thing to go and continue studying it, and it'll be an interesting thing to talk about in an interview. But like Daisy says, I'm not sure I would necessarily say just do it to tick another thing off on the application form. One thing I'd say is, and I did do a master's as well, so it may indicate that you have to, but I emphasise what Daisy said, which is you don't. But one thing I did really benefit from was during that year, I actually was able to do more extracurriculars, more work experience in law as part of the master's programme. And that I found almost just as useful to me as the studying. So it can be that master's programmes and the year you have doing further study can open up doors and opportunities, not just in the studying, but in other avenues. So look and do your research on master's programmes and where they could maybe lead you as well.
Yeah. I didn't do a master's. I had a rather different path to the bar, in fact, because I did my degree late. I was a single parent with two early teenage children when I did my degree, so I was in a tearing hurry. I couldn't have afforded to have done a master's as well as what was then the BVC, the bar course. So I didn't do one. I would quite have liked to, from pure interest point of view, but it's not necessary. We have people starting with us on Monday, and I think two of them don't have master's degrees. They do have good first-class degrees, it has to be said, but they don't have masters. And we don't necessarily, we'll come on to this later about levels of degrees, I think, but it's not necessary. And I, in fact, echo what Daisy and Mary said on this. If it's something you really, really want to do and you have the capacity to do it, you know, you're able to fund it, because funding is a massive issue. If you're able to fund it, if you're able to perhaps obtain funding towards it, then and you really think you're going to love it, then do it, because that love and enthusiasm will come out and carry you through. But if it's just oh gosh, this is one more box I've got to tick, I don't think it's going to help you very much.
Thank you, that was very helpful. And what experiences, other than the typical ones such as mooting and marshalling, would you find useful to have in an application? We know we just found out about grape picking, how it can be useful, but what else?
I would say that in a sense we've sort of covered this, because I think really the answer is any experiences you have had are potentially good ones to have on your application. I think it's really a matter of obviously you've got all of the sort of typical ones there that you've just read out. I think it really is a matter of considering what you've already done and having a think about how, as Cheryl said, you can sell those as, you know, relevant to any aspect of being a barrister. So I almost wouldn't want to put a bound on it and say, you know, these things would be useful and these things wouldn't, because I think it's almost there's a whole range of things that could potentially be good on an application and help you stand out.
Absolutely. And all I would add to that is I'm conscious that I think a lot of you are quite early days, and you're certainly an undergrad. I think a lot of you. Something that I wish I'd known more is without being too intense, try and keep a little bit of a record of what you do as part of your life now. You know, if you're part of any kind of society, even if you think it's completely irrelevant to potential jobs, it's, as Daisy says, it's not. If you're part of a sports team, you're involved in, you know, all that resilience stuff, and overcoming challenges and working in teams and all kinds of things that are useful. So try and keep maybe a little bit of a record. And if you do any, you know, if you do an internship or you do a volunteering position, try and remember little things about certain experiences you had, because suddenly it might be a couple of years before you're writing your applications, and then you're thinking, have I done anything in the last few years? But you will have done. You just need to, keep a record of it.
Yeah. Can I just add one other thing as well about all these experiences, including mini pupillages, but the great picking, or in my case, the thing that got me, the hook that got me interviews, was I was previously a hypnotherapist, and I think everybody just wanted to ask me about it. But with the mini pupillages, the great picking, the volunteering, all the things you do, don't just give us a list, because that's boring. Tell us what you learned from it, because that's what we're really looking for. We're looking for people who love learning. We're looking for people who want to learn. We're looking for people who learn from everything they do. So if you do a mini pupillage, you don't have to set out each one individually in your application form, but if you do a mini pupillage, just say something along the lines, the thing I learned at this particular mini pupillage was that things don't always go to plan, because we turned up at court and discovered that the case wasn't even listed. So what I learned there was that sometimes it's very frustrating and things don't go smoothly, and I have to be resilient and I have to deal with that. So it's what you've learned from these things, not just the fact that you've done. Doing something is one thing, but if you're very passive and you're not interactive and you're not learning, it's going to come across as being very passive and not and not learning, and that you're not a very active person. So come over as being an active learner in everything, even great picking. And I can't remember if the great picking applicant got the job, I'm afraid, Alex. So I can't tell you. Sorry.
Thank you. Now, moving on to clearing some common misinformation or stereotypes, how many mini pupillage would you think that a student ideally needs for their pupillage application?
So I think, I wouldn't say there is an ideal number. Some people will have more, some people will have fewer. I think sometimes actually where you see somebody has 10 mini pupillages and they're in all different areas, actually it might be because they started getting experience in one area, they didn't really like it, and then they looked at some other area and then they maybe did like it. And I don't think it's a case of the more the better, except insofar as in your own mind, it gives you a clearer picture of what different sets are like. When it comes to an application, I would say 2 or 3 mini pupillages is fine. I'll obviously defer to Cheryl if her view would be different, but I think 2 or 3 would be fine. I think 2, if they are in similar maybe areas of law to the chambers you're applying in, you can put, like, 2 is probably fine. 3, maybe if you have one that's in a slightly different area but still related, that would look good. I think if you do have 15, don't feel the need to put 15 on the application. Maybe pick a handful of the most relevant ones. But I think, just while I'm on this topic, just to scoop up one of the questions I saw in the chat function, clearly at the moment it is difficult to get mini pupillages. Chambers are very, very aware of that. There'll be you're not alone in struggling to get a mini pupillage at this time. At FTB, we haven't taken mini pupils for a while now. During the lockdown, we're still trying to get to grips with how we would have events that would run instead, or how we'd have virtual mini pupillages. I think it's still watch this space with those at the moment, but I don't let that scare you, because everyone's in the same boat, and it's going to come to no surprise if you say, I didn't get any mini pupillages in this year because of lockdown. No one's going to say, well, why didn't you try harder? I think it almost is more important that you come to events like this, that you go to any, you know, talks that are made public that chambers are doing, any sort of online pupillage fairs, all those sorts of things. I think do those instead, do what you can do, but don't lose sleep over not being able to do mini pupillages at the moment, because everyone's in the same boat.
Yeah, that's right. We did actually manage to get together at 3PB. I hauled all the pupils in, including the ones who haven't even started yet. And we did a two-part series, one with the pupils and then one with some of the barristers. Each runs for about an hour and a half, called To Pupillage and Beyond. They're available on our website. In fact, if you wanted to look at them, they do give an enormous amount of information about pupillage, not about mini pupillages. But if somebody mentioned on an application form, for example, that they'd seen, that they'd attended that, and they'd attended other things as well, again, I would look on them as somebody who was an active learner, and I wouldn't mark them down for not having had sufficient mini pupillages. I have to say that I switch off after 4 mini pupillages in an application form. It's very tedious, particularly the way that the gateway application form works, because if you put each of 10 mini pupillages in separately, your application form becomes incredibly long, and very often it's just well, you know, I went to court and I watched people do things, which is not terribly exciting. And in fact, one of the best applications we ever got, and yes, we did offer that person pupillage, they had put all their mini pupils together effectively into one box and just bullet pointed them. So I did these mini pupillages, and then at the bottom she said what she'd learned from all the mini pupillages. It was very impressive, very easy to follow and very easy to understand, and showed that she had put some real thought and organisation into it. So I pick up what Daisy and Mary were saying: make a note of what you're doing. And then when you come to do your applications, you can say, well, in the pandemic year, I went to this, I went to that, I took advantage of all the stuff that was online, I read everything. And that will count at least as much as many pupillages.
Yeah, and I would just add, I'd echo that obviously this year is unprecedented. And yeah, we were all sort of trying to learn how to adapt to it. There may be some, as much as there are the cons, many minis might not be running. Pros, maybe conferences online may be a bit cheaper. I've noticed that. So there may be more, if you do some research, there may be more events going on where you can learn about law and certain areas of law, but in a more cheaper way, remotely. So that's just one thing. But yeah, and I'd echo also what Daisy said. If in normal circumstances minis are a way for you to get experience and maybe tick things off your list of places you don't want to necessarily work, you don't have to put them all down on an application form. And I would just say more generally about, remember, when you are writing any application form, the aim of it is to get an interview. Well, certainly with pupillage, because I'm pretty sure most places will interview you for pupillage. So the aim of it is to get yourself into the room to have the interview. Be very careful about writing anything down on that application form that you would not feel comfortable talking about, or you know that you're maybe bigging up a bit too much. I've certainly had it. I can share an embarrassing example where my family are Tottenham Hotspur fans, but I have no idea what's going on with the team. And I thought putting the fact that I was a Spurs fan might make me stand out a bit, or make me seem I've got more character. And the first question I was asked when I got into the room with one Chambers was, do you think the problem with Spurs is Daniel Levy or the constant changing in managerial positions that we've had in the last few years? This guy was obviously a Tottenham fan. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't really know. And it just looked awful, and it was not a good way to start. So I share that with you so you don't make the same mistake I do on that kind of thing. Just be careful what you write, and sod's law, it will always be the one thing you don't want to talk about that they will pick.
Amazing, thank you. The next question is whether the university someone attends has an impact on their application.
Well, in our chambers, no. The short one, we don't care. We don't take any notice of A-levels either. Because we just take the view. We did a rethink about 5 or 6 years ago about our applications processes, And A-levels, for a number of reasons I won't go into, are inherently discriminatory. The way that they happen, and to be quite frank, by the time you're applying to us, you're usually about 5 years down the line. So we're looking for people who are on what we call exit velocity, who are improving, who will look as if they can learn and become better and better, rather than somebody who perhaps peaked 4 or 5 years ago. So we don't take any notice of university, we don't take any notice of A-levels. And can I just say as well, I know there was a question about age earlier, we were talking about it, it's on the list. Age, again, is pretty much irrelevant from our point of view. There are many, many things that older people can bring. There are many, many things that younger people can bring. We just want people who are really good. We don't really care about anything else.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can sort of combine, I think there's another question on grades and universities. One thing I'd say, it does vary between chambers of how important chambers might find. I don't think I could say that every chambers does blind marking and doesn't look at your universities. But what I would recommend doing is looking at, I think Daisy and I said we both did this, you look at the most junior tenants from the chambers you're looking to apply to and get somewhat of a sense of whether you're fitting in with they may have a theme of maybe they all have firsts. And if you don't have a first, I'm not saying don't necessarily apply, but just I found it useful when I was applying because I didn't have a first undergrad. And I had this stupid idea you had to have a first. You don't. I make that very clear. You very much don't have to have a first to go to the bar. But I remember, some sets, it seemed that everyone did have first, and maybe I wouldn't spend as much time applying to them as to sets where it was much more of a mix and I felt like I could see myself. I think that's the point, really. Look at the junior tenants and ask yourself honestly, can I see myself being the next one? And someone told me to do that and I found it useful.
Just one, I echo what already, just to gap. I think it's fair to say this is a changing area. I think a lot more chambers are reviewing the way that they look at applications, the way that they mark applications. Obviously, Cheryl said that their set already does blind. Do you do it blind marking of applications, or?
Yes, we do. We each application is marked separately by two people who don't know each other. It's marked blind, so there's no name on the application form, and they don't know who the other person is, so there's no inadvertent cross-contamination, if you like, of the marking process.
So I think it's I wouldn't want to give sort of blanket, yes, university matters, no, it doesn't. It really does depend on set, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to more general questions. How can one make the most out of a mini pupillage, and what are some do's and don'ts during a mini pupillage?
I think to get the most out of it for yourself, you really need to observe and really look. Try not to treat it as a sort of social event, although there will be something a little bit social if you're fortunate. Take a notebook with you, preferably something that looks fairly professional, because you will be working in a professional area. We had, and in fact, make sure everything looks moderately professional. We had a mini pupil who turned up who I had to ban from court on the first day because the phone cover that this particular mini pupil had was completely unsuitable. It had a comment on it which was probably funny at university but was not funny in court. So you're going as a professional, so be professional, but take a notebook and a pen with you, make notes of what's going. If you go into court, try and make a note of the hearing, because it may be that you're with a barrister on their own, because these days there aren't always solicitors in, and they may not be able to make a note of their own cross-examination. It's 25 years down the line, I still find it very hard to make notes of my own cross-examination because you're moving from document to document. So try and make a note of what's going on, and then just say afterwards, well, I got a bit of a note of that, if it's going to be of any help. And they may fall on your neck sobbing with joy and remember you. Ask questions, not when somebody's in the middle of something, but ask questions, show that you're interested, show that you're involved. And don't think that any question you ask is stupid. They're not. We all know that a mini pupil's coming in and you don't know anything about the bar, or most people will not know anything about it. So we don't mind if you ask questions that seem very simple or very, very basic. We'd rather you ask them, and it shows that you are engaging in the process, and that will help you as well.
There you go.
I would definitely echo all of that. I think the key thing is, if you're observing, you're more likely to exercise your judgment in an appropriate way. And I think it's very important when you are doing a mini pupillage, maybe in chambers it might be slightly more relaxed, and that's fine. I think often on a mini pupillage you'll be going with a barrister to court, and they will be stressed themselves, you know. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that you are there to watch, but this is their job. And I think sometimes, I mean, I've had mini pupils shadow me, and I've had mini pupils that are excellent and have been, you know, they slip in behind you, they're quiet, their phone is off, they take notes, and it's great. I think it's much easier almost to do something wrong in those situations. I've had mini pupils who have tried to speak to my client in the middle of a con that was very pressured just before hearing, which I didn't appreciate at that moment. If she'd had, you know, points she wanted to discuss with me afterwards, that would have been absolutely fine, and I'd have been, you know, happy to do that. But I think it's just really having an awareness of the environment that you're in, having your phone switched off at the right time, you know, absolutely asking questions, but just having an eye to when they're appropriate to ask. I just think all of those things are really important to bear in mind, because, you know, we're absolutely not infallible. We get very stressed out just before court hearings, and you know, ultimately barristers are having you along because they want to, and because they believe that mini pupillages are important. But it's not something that they're obliged to do. They're doing it because they want to, and you know, you want to sort of make sure that you don't make their lives difficult, to be frank.
Yeah, and often they will, after the court hearing, that they will maybe take you out for a coffee and talk about the case. So just, I mean, that might happen. I think I would echo what both Daisy and Cheryl said. You know, be there to offer help, but maybe know when to stay out of the way as well, because as Daisy says, things can get quite stressed and heated before court. I think I would very much echo the keeping notes. You think you'll remember people's names. If you're anything like me, you will not. Remember that, like I like to say, in a bit like actors and actresses, most barristers have a website page that, you know, is affiliated with their chambers. So that can be your friend. If you've forgotten someone's name, look them up on the chamber's website, find their photo. Because, you know, when I meet a lot of people, sometimes they start to all look quite similar. So yeah, I definitely would recommend reminding yourself that you can always look people up later in chambers websites. Keep notes of what you're watching, and I would echo what Cheryl said about keep notes if you're in court, not just because that would be very useful potentially if the barrister you're shadowing hasn't got a note of what's happened, but also because when you're watching something passively, it's a lot more easier to switch off, I find. And so I learned all the tricks of the trade, I think, doing minis, of how to stay awake in court. And I meant no disrespect, it could be the most interesting case, but if I don't have the papers in front of me and I don't understand what's going on because I haven't read the materials, it will be difficult to follow. So if you keep a note, it actually keeps you engaged a bit more, which is a plus, I think. So I would just add that.
I was just actually going to ask, just add one more thing, because it might seem like a bit of a niche thing, but it is really important. I think especially in our area of law, what you often have is you have two members of chambers on opposite sides of the same case. And I think at other chambers that happens quite a lot as well, and that's absolutely fine. But you have to remember, if you go along with one side to watch, you are effectively, whatever is discussed with that barrister and that client team is confidential. And so I have, heard horrible stories about many pupils falling very innocently into errors where they've, emailed barristers on both sides saying, thank you so much for letting me come along today. And if you scroll down the email chain, it's got all the documents from one side and they shouldn't ever have been disclosed to the other. So I think it's just little things like that, it sounds like maybe that would never come up for you, but if it does come up, just bear it in mind.
And always check when it comes to papers. Always check if you are, whether you can take them home with you or what you can do with them, because that too is somewhere where, you are subject to confidentiality when you come into chambers. So yeah,
and whether you can mark them, because I've also had an experience where I started highlighting away and someone said, no, they're the originals.
This is us just telling you all our horror stories, basically. Learn from us.
Sorry, but I just had flashback there, a touch of PTSD when that happened to me. So yes, do be careful. I have to say that one of the good things about what's happened with COVID is that we've all become much more digital. I've been trying to go paperless for some time, and I've now been forced into it, and it's great. So the problem that you have now is you tend to have multiple copies of the same set of papers, and you can't remember which ones you've marked up and which ones you haven't. But having the original document and finding that somebody's scribbled on it is horrendous. So don't write on anything, basically, unless it's your own notebook.
Thank you. I hope everyone took note of that. Now, because you mentioned, Daisy and Maro, that you are still busy after the panel, if we could still take a couple of minutes to answer a couple of questions from the chat function, because we are done with the prepared question, if that is all right.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone has any questions, please leave them in the chat. There is one that is here. Do you think that not having a mini pupillage will have a negative impact on a scholarship application?
I think I would echo what we've already said about the specifics of this year. I really hope that scholarship process through the Inns of Court, and for any of you who don't know, all barristers need to be associated with one of 4 Inns of Court. It's a bit like Hogwarts in my view, and they are the ones that mainly offer the financial support for the bar course, and actually also for the GDL as well, for the 1-year conversion course. They can help with that too, and they do an application process to try and get that funding. Do look at that, because the 4 Inns vary actually in the way they do their scholarship programs and how they assess them, so that can be quite an important reason why people pick a particular inn. That and the quality of the food, I think, is also seemingly quite important. But anyway, I hope that when they come to their scholarship applications after this year, they will be sympathetic to the fact that it has just been almost impossible to get a mini pupillage during the lockdown. So hopefully it would not be a requirement, and I if I was involved, I certainly would be bearing that in mind. So yeah.
Can I maybe move on to one of the other questions, because it's quite an interesting one, I thought. Is commercial awareness a key for getting a pupillage job? Well, first of all, can I just say pupillage isn't really a job. It's training. And it's a very tough training year, I have to say. It's like a year-long, it's basically a year-long interview, because at the end of pupillage, what you want is for the chambers to go, we love you, you've done really, really well, and would you like to be a tenant with us? In other words, would you like to come and work with us and pay us money? Because as I said earlier, tenants pay money into chambers, not the other way around. So is commercial awareness, I think it's really helpful. I don't think it's a key principle. I don't think but it could be a final brick, if you like, in building your application wall, because commercial awareness in terms of the bar is something that's relatively recent. It used to be considered positively wrong to have any idea about money. We left that kind of things to the clerks, but things have moved on. We have to be commercially aware. We have to be aware of marketing. We have to sell ourselves. We have to go out there. We're self-employed, and although we're working under the umbrella of chambers, we have to have a real knowledge of how things work. We have to deal with accountants. We have to deal with VAT because we attract VAT. So commercial awareness, I think, is an enormous help, as is one of the things that I am telling people that they really should be spending time doing, which is to make sure that you're digitally competent, so that you can really use something like Word and Excel. You can really use PDF editors to help yourself. And these are things that we're certainly starting to look for on our application forms, which is, there's an awareness of this need. We don't write with quill pens on parchment anymore. So just one other tip for something that might make you a little bit more interesting and a little bit more desirable as a pupil.
Thank you. And one last question was, how do you get to specialize in a specific area of law once you qualify as barrister? I know we touched on this briefly earlier, but if we could expand on it.
Well, I think one thing I'd say is that certain chambers are already very much specialised, so do look at that when you're applying, because they will already have the contacts in certain areas of law, and that's where you'll probably be getting most of your work. And I think, sort of tacked onto that, one thing I would say is certainly when you're at law school or you're a student and you're looking to get into the bar, the focus is always on getting pupillage, because it is competitive. It's very competitive. There's no shying away from it. There aren't that many spots and there's a lot of people applying. But one thing, even if it feels a bit unnatural, when you're so wanting to get pupillage, you've got to think about tenancy, which is what Cheryl just mentioned, because that is actually the end goal. And it's a job for life, potentially. Once you're a tenant, you're really in for life. If you want to be, you can have a career as a barrister for the rest of your life. And so you've got to ideally like the area of law that you're working in. So do really think and try, and that's the minis all come into this, but think about the areas that you're interested in, because if you're applying to a chambers, it's not just about doing the training and getting the pupillage, but hopefully staying on with them and working in that area for maybe quite some time. So yeah, a lot, and chambers I think are increasingly specialising, but it varies, and some chambers do a huge variation of areas of law. So it's really about doing your research, I guess, on the different chambers and what they do.
One thing that I'd just add to that is that it's interesting, because obviously looking at a chamber's website sometimes gives a slightly skewed impression of the areas of law they do, because they will list, areas of law that they have one person practicing in. And that's why, finding out a bit more about the chambers, if you can, is useful, or looking at what the cases that they've done recently are. And if you see, one in the last 10 years in a particular area of law, I probably, wouldn't have your heart set on just practicing in that area of law in that chambers. And I think just add to that, in some chambers, not really ours, but I know in some chambers, there are certain areas of law that as a junior, you will be much more focused on, which may slightly skew your idea of which chambers you want to apply to, because if there's one area of law, if you don't want to do personal injury, for example, and actually speaking to juniors at chambers, you will do personal injury for the first 5 years, it's something to just bear in mind. I think it is difficult when you don't really have an inside scoop on the chambers, but it's something to bear in mind, definitely.
Yeah, if I can just come in on that, because my chambers is very different from Daisy and Merrow's. That's I have to say, premier planning chambers, and they focus on that. We're much more general in terms of, we are one of the largest chambers in the country. There's 200 of us. We we are split into groups, so we have 12 specific groups, but obviously we're stronger in some than in others. We also have 6 different physical locations, and our different physical locations, in a sense, are different, have different focuses. So Winchester, we have one of the top criminal groups in the country. They're exceptionally good, but we have nobody doing crime in London, which is our commercial and chancery centre. So for us, where you go will probably will probably influence what you do or what you can do. But we're a bit more flexible, so you can start with us and say, well, I'm really interested in, for example, commercial law, and then discover that actually you love family law, and that's what you want to do. We had, if I can just tell you about this, one of our pupils this year, Tabo, is a doctor, and he came in clearly to do clinical negligence and personal injury, which he did for his first 4 months. Then COVID hit, and he ended up doing marine regulatory work. And he absolutely loves it, and he wants to specialise in it. So he's completely switched. He's still going to do the clin neg, because in the first 5 or 6 years in our chambers, you tend to be not totally focused on one area. But he's discovered this sudden love of marine regulatory work, simply because his pupil supervisor did some of it, and he was asked to help out in COVID. He was asked to help out with writing an article, and did an extremely good job. So from our point of view, you don't have to make a decision, but you have to have an idea. It would not be possible, for example, I think, to really come into crime and then swap over into intellectual property, because they are so different. You'd practically have to go back and do a pupillage in intellectual property in order to swap over from crime.
I definitely reiterate that I think sometimes you don't know what you want to do until you start doing it, and it can be the most bizarre areas of law. I didn't even know. I've done quite a lot of work in rights of way law, people's rights to use public rights of way. I never even knew that was a necessary area of law. So the thing, life can surprise you, I guess, is what I
always say to our pupils, and I think it's particularly opposite in our particular chambers, which is you don't actually choose your area of law, it ends up choosing you very often. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time, I'm an insolvency lawyer as much as anything, that's what I really want to do, but I end up always doing quite a lot on equity and trusts. For some reason, equity and trusts likes me, and so I'll be sitting there going, no, I just want to do insolvency. And somebody will say, well, this is insolvency, but you know what? It's a trust in insolvency. So you can't always get away from it.
And just now, I'm very sorry, but I think Daisy really had to run, so she sends her apologies, but says goodbye. And I'm going to probably have to follow suit, unfortunately, as well.
Thank you. That was the last of our questions. Thank you all very much for your time and for these valuable insights and pieces of advice. I will now yield over to Tanisha for the conclusion of the panel.
Well, thank you all for coming. It was lovely to see so many of you here, and a massive thank you to our panelists on behalf of QMCAS Society and the Commercial Awareness Society. I hope everybody took away all those pearls of wisdom and all the tips and will use them in their future applications. Just a small reminder that we have a non-law panel event coming up on the 6th of October. So the link to RSVP your place is in the chat box. So feel free to click on that and reserve your place. Other than that, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the event.
Thank you very much for organising it.
Thank you.